Well, good morning. Well, the morning after a city sports championship is always a lot of fun. So I see some red, and we have a couple of props here. Yes. So congratulations, go Caps, to the city. I'm Anand Parikh. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I want to welcome all of you to today's event entitled Healthy Homes Equal Healthier Lives. For those of you who are new to BPC, our mission is to actively seek to combine the best ideas from both political parties to promote health, security, and opportunity for all Americans. We drive principled and politically viable policy solutions through the power of analysis, negotiation, and advocacy. On Monday, BPC released a report highlighting the importance of more tightly linking federal health and housing policies to improve health status and quality of life for vulnerable Americans, while more efficiently and effectively allocating limited resources. BPC's report makes specific recommendations for HUD and Health and Human Services, HHS, on how to better collaborate on issues ranging from healthy homes to healthy aging to behavioral health and disaster preparedness and recovery. Simply speaking, we spend more time in our home setting than anywhere else. If we want to improve health, look no further than the home. Whether it's safer homes to prevent falls, or to reduce lead exposure and asthma triggers, or whether it's bringing health services into the home, into the congregate settings, or through telehealth, health housing integration is the future. And for those without a home, homeless, or at risk for homelessness, or low-income renters, these are the most vulnerable and deserve our attention. That's what makes affordable housing policy so important in this country. BPC's current efforts build on previous work led by BPC's Senior Health and Housing Task Force, co-chaired by former HUD Secretaries Henry Cisneros and Mel Martinez, and former members of Congress Allison Schwartz and Vin Weber, as well as builds on previous efforts of BPC's Housing Commission, led by the two secretaries, along with former Senator Kit Bond and former Senate Majority Leader and BPC co-founder George Mitchell. Today we are honored to be joined by HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson, who will be coming on stage in a moment with BPC President Jason Grimet. Following a discussion with Secretary Carson, we'll have a panel discussion with healthcare and housing leaders on how to accelerate health housing integration in the public and private sectors. As a reminder, this event is being streamed live online, and a recording will be available next week. We invite you to interact with us on Twitter about today's event using hashtag BPCLive and the handle BPC_bipartisan. We'll be taking questions today after both of our discussion panels. If you have questions after the first panel, we have note cards available. Please write down your questions on the card, and you can do this as the discussion is ongoing, and someone will be around to collect them. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ben Carson, who is the 17th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Prior to serving in the administration for nearly 30 years, Secretary Carson served as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center. Dr. Carson has received dozens of honors and awards in recognition of his achievements, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Dr. Carson has authored 9 books, 4 of which he co-wrote with his wife, Candy. He and his wife have also co-founded the Carson Scholars Fund, which recognizes young people of all backgrounds for exceptional academic and humanitarian accomplishments. Born in Detroit to a single mother with a 3rd grade education who worked multiple jobs to support their family, Secretary Carson was raised to love reading and education. He and his wife are the proud parents of 3 adult sons and 3 grandchildren. And Mr. Secretary, as someone also born in Detroit, also a graduate of the University of Michigan Medical School, and also a faculty member at Johns Hopkins Hospital, so nice to welcome you to BPC. So at this time, please welcome HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson and BPC President Jason Grimet to the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. I see some very happy and a couple of tired-looking folks in the crowd today. We have our towels up here in case anything spills. It's a real honor, Secretary, to be with you here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. As Anand says, housing and the fundamental role that housing plays in economic growth and education and mental health has really been core to a lot of our work over the years. And my first question to you is, as Dr. Carson, you are the 17th Secretary of HUD, but the first person with the medical history to lead this agency. And I just wonder if you could just broadly, how does your worldview as a physician influence your imagination of the role of the Secretary of the Housing Department?
Well, first of all, delighted to be here. My Deputy Secretary, Pam Petnote, sends her regards.
We miss Pam.
And, I had a conversation last week with Megan Sandel from the Boston Medical Center regarding this whole topic. And it's obviously something that's very important to me. As a pediatric neurosurgeon, I spent a lot of time working very hard on little kids, sometimes operating all night long, trying to give them a second chance at life. And most of the times we were successful. But then I found myself in a terrible dilemma, because a few days later they're ready to go home. And many of those homes were pretty awful places. I mean, rats and roaches and bed bugs and mold and lead and crime. And you just say, how in the world can you in good conscience send somebody back into an environment like that? Well, now there's an actual opportunity to try to fix that. And, I feel very, very passionate about the need to recognize that your home is the foundation of your security. And you'll notice when, a squirrel, you go up to a squirrel, what do? They run back to their hole. Any place, that is your security. And we have to recognize that as a society and begin to think about, how do we provide a holistic, nurturing environment for our people? The people who don't have that, and the poor, the disabled, the elderly, those are the people who are at greatest risk of health problems related to insecure housing. So it's a perfect nexus for us to be working with HHS and with multiple other agencies in order to see what we can do to provide safe housing and affordable housing for our populace.
So let's talk a little more about the partnership with HHS. Their budget's slightly larger than HUD's by a factor of about 20. And there's been a big conversation in this country about the need to focus on health care, not sick care, and the social determinants of health. And as you just alluded to, housing as really that foundation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the programs and some of the collaboration? How do you and the Secretary of HHS get together?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We do.
How does that work?
It works actually very well. We talk about some of the things, obviously dealing with lead, for instance, because, you hear about lead and you think you know something about it. But the fact of the matter is, for children under the age of 6, lead exposure can have a devastating impact on the development of the brain. And not just a short-term impact, but a very long-term impact, which can affect the way that person thinks and behaves throughout their entire life, greatly decreasing, their potential. And that costs us as a society, not only monetarily, and it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single individual, but also in terms of lost potential.
Sure.
And we have to recognize that our people are our biggest resource. And really, that's where we should be aiming our policies. Looking at prevention is another thing that we've been talking about, because it costs a lot less if we can prevent the thing than it does when we're trying to treat it. So when you're looking at something like asthma, and you're looking at poor ventilation, you're looking at rats and roaches and other types of pests and the kinds of things that they bring into the environment, you look at the mold, and you look at the impact on our society, on our HHS budget for asthma. You're talking multiple billions of dollars every single year. So when we're talking about remediating these kinds of things and programs to remediate them, that's going to be a great benefit to our entire society. Also, we're talking about data sharing because, we have a lot of data that's accumulated through the programs. HHS has a lot of data. And when we learn how to overlay that data in order to identify the areas that are most in need of services and to target the areas where we should concentrate our efforts. Not that we would neglect any effort, but we need to be able to target to get the biggest bang for the buck.
Well, I was sharing with the Secretary earlier that we here at the Bipartisan Policy Center also have a quaint affinity for data and evidence, and we find that there's a great amount of work to do to gather the evidence, and then we often stop. And the fact that you actually want to use the evidence in a way that is going to be publicly accessible, something I want to talk about a little bit.
Well, interestingly enough, if you look at longevity in this country, and you go back to the previous turn of the century, not the one at 2000, but the one before that, the average age of death was in the 50s. At the last turn of the century, we're approaching 80. Now, how did that happen? Was there some kind of miraculous improvement in our genetic structure? I don't think so. What happened is that the medical profession began to use evidence instead of ideology in terms of the policies for our health, and what a difference it has made.
So, Mr. Secretary, you talked about lead and asthma, which I think have been long understood to be kind of chronic health issues affecting families. We're focused a lot right now, and I know you are too, on the opioid epidemic, which, as I think about it, is really the crucible of almost everything that's not working right now in American society. And it is, like so many kind of chronic issues, focused on people who don't have the resources and the access to care. Where are you on this? What is HUD's role going to be in battling this crisis? Is this an opportunity for you as a physician to really lead the administration?
Well, as you know, the president declared the opioid epidemic a national health emergency. And it really is, and it affects every level of our society, from the lowest economic rung to the highest economic rung. We have drugs coming in, from our southern border. Now we have drugs coming in through the mail. A lot of comes in through the water. Last week was the installation of the new commander of the Coast Guard. And they were talking about how much drugs are being interdicted by the Coast Guard. I mean, by the boatload, no pun intended, is coming in. And it's actually the largest area of our government that is actually able to intercept these things. But here's what we need to be thinking about: the holistic treatment of people with opioid addiction. And we have a lot of programs all over the country aimed at this, but a lot of them are not adequately funded and don't really take into account the fact that opioids actually change the brain. Now, people think you get addicted to opioids because you get an injury and the doctor gives you these medications. That's all true. But what most people don't know is that opioids are terrible when it comes to pain relief. They're not the best pain relief at all. And in fact, someone who is able to accurately describe things for you, you give them opioids for pain and then ask them, how's their pain? And they'll say, it's still there, I just don't care. Because that's what it does, it makes you not care about the pain. And it doesn't matter what kind of pain it is. It can be emotional pain as well. And that's exactly, I think, the reason that we're having such an epidemic. There's so many people in our society who have lost hope, who are thinking, I can't make it. the system is stacked against me. Those people hate me. I'm just going to go over here and sit in my corner. If I can get some kind of relief from that for an hour or two or a day, I'm going to take it. Mm-hmm. We need to be thinking, and this is a departure from what a lot of people think, but we need to be thinking about how do we create the right kind of nurturing environment mm-hmm. for our people so that they don't feel like it's hopeless. That's one of the reasons that, we started the Envision Centers.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so yesterday in Detroit, you announced the first of what I think will be 17 of these Envision Centers. And
17 in the first cohort. That would be
so hot off the
cohorts.
presses, Mr. Secretary. I'm guessing that everyone here does not yet know the imagination and the kind of goals of the Envision Centers. Why don't you give us a few minutes on that?
Well, it actually was inspired by a verse in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 29:18. It says, "Without a vision, the people perish." And that is absolutely true. You have to have that vision. It was Helen Keller who said, "I would rather be without sight than without vision." And, when people don't think that there's hope and they can't see that American dream for them, they give up. Well, Envision Centers actually bring the resources of our government, federal, state, local, as well as nonprofits, faith-based communities, private sector, all together under a single roof, along with the need. The system, the way it exists now, is so complex, I don't think Einstein could work his way through them, quite frankly. But we're fixing it so that people can actually get the kind of services that they need. So that that young mother whose education ended with that first baby now can be directed to the appropriate place for her child care so she can get her GED, her bachelor's degree, become self-sufficient, teach that to her children. And we're coordinating services to be able to do that. For instance, I didn't even know this myself, but the Department of Defense has a program where they will come into a multi-family dwelling and they will teach elderly residents there the fundamentals of child care to the point where they can get certification. All of a sudden, they now have the possibility of being able to take care of some of their neighbors' children while those young women go out and get their education finished and become independent. That's what I mean when I talk about amalgamating and coordinating services. Those are the kinds of things that would make a difference, making it possible for mentoring to occur for people. Many studies have shown that young people, particularly disadvantaged, who are mentored, finish high school at a much higher rate than those who do not. And also, when it comes to data and poverty, look at some of the data that was accumulated by some of the foundations that have been looking at poverty. And discovered that there are 3 factors that reduce your risk of living in poverty to 2% or less. Number 1, finish high school. Number 2, get married. Number 3, wait until you're married to have children. Those 3 things, less than 2% chance of living in poverty. That's big news. And we should be thinking about that. And that's one of the reasons that, we're looking at ways to reevaluate rent structures so that they don't discourage marriage. Right now, if your income goes up, regardless of what the cause is, like bringing in another source of income, your rent goes way up, or you lose your eligibility all of a sudden. And that's why when we go into a lot of these places, like I was in a place recently with 700 units, 99% of them occupied by single women with children. And I'm sure that if we provide the right kinds of circumstances, we're not going to have a continuation of that. But we have to change that policy so that we don't punish people when they begin to climb the ladder, when they begin to get increased income, when they get married, things like that. And I don't think we did it intentionally, but it's where we ended up. And we have to deal with where we are now.
So I think that we should talk a little about the incentives around HUD support for the poorest folks in these situations, because I think there's a strong sense that some of these incentives are really disincentives to progress.
They're perverse.
But there has been a lot of confusion in the last couple of months about the proposal that came out in late April, which was kind of simplistically described as, we're just trying to triple the rents on impoverished people.
I'm glad you brought that up.
I knew you would be. And again, you made some statements about this yesterday, which I want to give you a chance to really build upon. But there was concern that this essentially could take, 1 million vulnerable kids and put them on that borderline between having a house, even not a great one, and having no house. And I know you know better than anybody in this room, it's hard to lift people up when they're on the streets.
Exactly.
What was going on in the proposal? Because my understanding is now that you've found some more resources, but just take us back to April, and what was the imagination behind that proposal?
It's always good to ask questions like that, because if you filter things through the media, you get a very distorted view. For instance, just as an example, small market, fair market rents. They said Carson's against that. He's against people being able to move into areas of opportunity. What a bunch of crap. There were a bunch of places that said, we're not ready to switch over yet. So what we said is that if you're ready to switch over, you can switch over immediately. And if you're not, we're going to give you more time. The media reinterprets that as something else. But with the rent structure, what we're trying to do is actually create the right environment to get people out of poverty. Now, in terms of the rent increases, the tripling of rent, that was for people who pay the minimum rent. $50 a month is the minimum rent. And we proposed raising that to $150. Very few people who actually are receiving housing assistance pay the minimum rent. So, that was really blown way out of proportion. But the reason we had to consider raising rents at all is because we were dealing with a $41 billion budget. And in order to be able to keep from raising rents on the elderly and the disabled, and in order to not displace people who were already being taken care of, that was necessary. Now that the budget has been changed, the necessity for doing that is not urgent. So now I say we will do what is necessary based on the budget that we have. But that was the reason, and I don't think that reason is quite as urgent now. So in our negotiations with Congress, obviously there will be a fair amount of latitude in that particular area. But the parts of the rent reform that the media doesn't talk about are the important parts. And that is giving local control to PHAs and landlords to be able to enact programs that will increase the likelihood of self-sufficiency, of doing triannual, every 3-year evaluation of your income, because obviously your rent is based on your income. And that way you don't have people turning down raises or turning down promotions because they don't want their rent to go up. Those are the kinds of things that are important. And if people were less inflammatory and actually tried to work together, I try to work together with people that they don't want to work with you. They say they do, but they don't. They just want, whatever they want. I think there is a lot of potential in our society and a lot of good ideals, and they come from both sides. And we have to stop this my way or the highway business. In medicine, one of the reasons I think we were very successful, during my time, is because we listened to people who had different ideals. And sometimes it wasn't your ideal. But when you really stop and you talked about it and you begin to hash it out and you begin to amalgamate the ideals, all of a sudden you realize it is a good ideal. And what we need to be thinking about as a society right now is that we only have 330 million people, a quarter of what China and India have, and we have to compete with them in the future. We have to develop all of our people. Our policies have to be aimed at developing our people, not aimed at, creating a group of people who are beholden to you, but we need to be thinking about the strength of our country, and we're very open to suggestions at HUD right now, because it's my belief that the government works for the people. The people don't work for the government. A lot of bureaucrats don't realize that, but we realize that. And when people have good ideas and they can show that they work with evidence, with real data, believe me, you will have a very open ear.
Mr. Secretary, you have just given the Bipartisan Policy Center elevator speech with greater skill than I often do, so I'm going to make sure we get that on our website. Because this place is about the constructive collision of ideas, right? People who fundamentally have strong, deeply seated personal views who are willing to listen to people they disagree with, and I really appreciate your presenting it in that manner. I want to come back on the Envision Centers, because I think they, in my mind, and I know this is an idea you're just fleshing out, but they fill a really interesting space in this larger debate about individual responsibility and how people lift themselves up. Because I think one of the other aspects of the rent reform discussion, but it's broadly throughout the entire welfare reform discussion, is this idea of work requirements. And I think the imagination behind work requirements is opportunity. Give people a chance to have the skills and the discipline and I think the sense of achievement. And the contrary view is that they're punitive, right? That they're somehow punishments, that you're taking people who don't have childcare, don't have transportation, don't have the right attire, and you're just basically forcing them to kind of, make poverty even a little harder.
Right.
Would working in an Envision Center, would taking a GED class in an Envision Center, would getting help, would that be, in your mind, something that should be creditable towards that idea of a work requirement?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a wraparound concept. The reason the HUD VASH program works is because HUD provides the housing and the VA provides the wraparound services. That's why there's been a dramatic drop in homelessness in veterans. Many of these people are traumatized, the veterans, and if you just give them a house, it doesn't work. And if you just give them wraparound services, it doesn't work. But when you do it together, it works. It's the same kind of thing we're talking about here. People have to be able to get the skills, right? You probably saw 2 days ago in the headlines that there are now more jobs than there are people looking for jobs. The problem is a lot of those jobs are skilled jobs.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons that we put this excessive emphasis now on Section 3, part of the Fair Housing Act. It says if you're getting HUD money, you have an obligation to hire, train, and give contracts to the low-income people in that area. People found all kinds of ways to skirt that. We're putting some teeth in it and some incentives to make sure that it is used, because we have the workforce. All we have to do is train them. And when you give people those marketable skills, now they're able to climb the ladder of self-sufficiency. And again, I keep using that word because it's so important to me. Growing up in an environment where there were a lot of very poor and disadvantaged people, but I did see people escape. I was one of them. Kind of recognize what's necessary to get out of there. And that's what I want to try to provide for everybody else. Those same kinds of advantages that I had because I had a bulldog mother who just, I could tell you all day about my mother.
Those intangibles. Yeah.
Absolutely. But if everybody had a mother like mine, we wouldn't have these problems. But anyway, we do need to provide all of those things for our people, and we need to stop fighting. The thing that will destroy our nation is the horrible wedge driving. Race, income, religion, political affiliation, age, you name it, driving wedges of hatred. It's destroying our society. There have been many other societies historically that have been destroyed by it. There have been none, I guarantee you, that have been helped by it.
So one of the fights that's a good fight in a democracy is about resources and priorities. And we struggle with this all the time. We care deeply about fiscal sustainability. We work on the debt and deficit all the time. I think it is tragic that my kids have a $20 trillion check waiting for them when they enter the workforce.
26 trillion.
We are, and they're going to be disappointed to hear that.
Hold that thought for a moment, because I just want to piggyback on that. If we continue to accumulate debt at the rate that we're doing it, by the year 2048, every penny the government takes in will be used to service the debt. There will be no money for any programs. There'll be no money for the military. And there are several countries that have gone bankrupt. You know their stories. They all knew 30 years ahead of time that they were going bankrupt. What did they do? Kick the can down the road. Are we smart enough to be both compassionate and fiscally responsible?
So if you could come back with Secretary Mnuchin, I would love to have a tax policy forum at the BPC, because we now have an envelope, right, of real pressure. The amount of pressure on the federal budget, if you believe CBO and others, is now increased by about $1 trillion. And so we're very concerned about that, as I know you are too, and I read your book. And at the same time, the amount of resources in affordable housing just don't seem adequate to the task. I mean, my understanding is there's about a 7 million gap between affordable housing and need. I know you are always struggling to figure out with the resources you have how to, I mean, you just said you have to choose between providing resources for the elderly, the disabled, and the impoverished. That's not a fun choice.
No, it's not.
So how do you, as a leader of the administration and a leader of HUD, how do you reconcile that? I mean, do we have enough resources at HUD to address the imperatives that are in your mandate?
Well, no. But necessity is the mother of invention. And we're smart people. And what we have to do is we have to figure out how do we get bang for the buck. And that means looking at the data, looking at the things that actually work. When it comes to homelessness, for instance, there's more than 7,000 different homelessness programs that we support through the continuum of care. But what we're doing now is we're looking at the ones that are actually getting people out of poverty. We're getting, there was one group in Columbus, Ohio, a transition housing group. They were getting people off the streets, families off the street, and into permanent housing in less than 30 days. I mean, it was absolutely phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it before. And, I made the mistake of complimenting them. I said, you have nice facilities, but it's not luxurious, but you put your money where it needs to be, getting people. And there was a reporter there, and I said, Carson says poor people shouldn't live in comfort. What a bunch of crap. But, this is the society that we live in today. Everybody just trying to create problems. But what if we use that energy to try to solve problems?
So I just got handed about a dozen really good questions. I have one of my own before I start to refer to these. And that is the focus on the incredible challenge your department and the country's been facing around natural disasters. As I think everyone knows, last year, country suffered about $300 billion in disaster-related damage. Just when it comes to housing alone, I think we had about 25 million people displaced. 5 million people sought immediate kind of FEMA assistance because they were at least temporarily homeless. I know my dear friend Pam has been in Puerto Rico more than she might have imagined when she accepted this position. How's that going? I mean, can you talk a little bit about HUD's role? And then again, do you feel like does the country have a system to both be resilient to and effectively respond to these disasters?
Good question. Well, I mean, this was an unprecedented season that we just went through, so I got to be baptized in the fire. But, we have put resources on the ground before each one of the hurricanes. Before it happened, it began identifying where we could place people and what kinds of things needed to be done, and have remained there throughout, working hand in hand with FEMA. As you know, HUD is responsible for the long-term recovering, FEMA for the short-term. But we began working together immediately, providing forbearance on people with their mortgages, and moratoriums on foreclosures, providing certain types of loans and tacking the cost on at the end of the mortgage. Those are the kinds of things that are tangible that really help people, but also, dispersing the $35.4 billion several months ahead of the time that it's needed, by getting rid of a lot of the regulatory barriers, by being able to extend waivers, so that, if the environment in one area is not being changed dramatically, you don't have to have 3 or 4 different agencies come in and do an environmental review. Those are the kinds of things that previously have kept people from being able to get the money. So, we're getting the money out, and also we now have a CFO at HUD for the first time in many years, and putting in the financial controls, everything from furniture to to disaster relief, so that we take care, we really protect the taxpayers' money, and it makes all the difference in the world. So we've also been talking to FEMA, to SBA, to all the agencies involved, and continue to do that on a regular basis. What can we learn each time so that we can make sure that we're much more efficient? But the thing that has really sped things up this time has been getting rid of a lot of the regulatory barriers that have been stacked one on top of another, and I think they were all put there for good reasons, but when new ones come along, they're supposed to replace the other ones, not add to them, and that's what's caused a lot of the backlog.
So you have some optimism that next time we are surprised by one of these predictable events, we're going to be in better shape.
It's going to be even better, guaranteed.
I'm going to turn to these questions, and I think there's some others. We probably have about another 10 minutes with the Secretary, so that's a chance for probably 4 or 5 of these. One of the issues, and I wanted to mention, is that Secretary Cisneros, who works with us here, was here yesterday and asked me to relate publicly how enthusiastic he is for the conversations he's had with you.
Yes, we've had.
One of his key issues has been this question of aging in place. We as a society have a tremendous number of people who are now aging, who want to stay in their homes, and who find that their own homes are no longer safe places for them. Our belief is that there could be investments that would save the society a lot of money and increase the dignity of people to stay in their homes, but we don't have a very good system of having HUD and HHS figure out where that money comes from. Can Medicaid resources be used to build ramps and bars in people's homes and bathrooms? And do you see aging in place as a priority for HUD, and what could you be doing to help us understand that?
It is very much a priority on several different levels. As you probably know, we've made some pretty substantial changes to the reverse mortgage program, which allows people to age in place. Again, the way it was originally structured, it really didn't take into account, surviving spouses and longevity that we're seeing in our society. So that's been fixed, and we continue to work on that. But in terms of aging in place and retrofitting houses, the reason that's so important is because each year we spend about $66 billion with a B dollars on elderly people who fall because these things are not done. And quite frankly, we could spend a lot less than that retrofitting the houses. So those conversations are being had right now. People are at least starting to recognize that this is an issue, and if we deal with it, in advance, it's going to cost us a lot less and save a lot of grief for these elderly people.
A question from an enthusiastic budgeteer says, wow, those Envision Centers sound great. Where's the money coming from? Is it new money, or is it taking money away from existing programs?
I am so glad you asked that question. The money is already there. What we're doing is coordinating the resources at the local level. This is not a federal government program. We're helping to coordinate and organize it, but it was intentionally designed not as a government program because we want those resources to be owned and the responsibility to lie with the local community. And that way, when the administration changes, the Envision Center doesn't go away.
Mm-hmm. Question about mental health and homelessness. I think and I'll elaborate on this a little bit because it's something we are focused and care a lot about. 50 years ago, then Governor Reagan basically deinstitutionalized California for a lot of very good reasons. 50 years later, the dominant issue in the mayor's race in San Francisco is whether they essentially reinstitutionalize. There is a sense that about half of the people who are homeless are either mentally challenged or have some kind of substance abuse issue, and we are either leaving them on the streets or institutionalizing them in prison. And that, challenging as it is, the idea of creating new state-based facilities where you essentially commit people to residence is now back in the discussion. Really hard concepts to get your head around. But how do you see the chronic homelessness problem that is exploding in a lot of cities, and do you think this is a reasonable response?
Well, it's not an either-or situation. But the fact of the matter is, it was probably done the wrong way when we just dumped, thousands of mentally ill people out on the street and said you're on your own. That's not reasonable. But there are a lot of the homelessness programs right now that deal with the mentally ill quite effectively. It's a matter of being able to gain their trust and have the appropriate types of medical professionals available to them to give them the support that they need to be able to exist in a free society outside and to protect themselves and to protect others. But it's being done. There are many programs that are very successful. We need to model on those ones. And we do also need to just take a reality pill and realize there are some people who really shouldn't be out on the street. And, we still have a responsibility to take care of them in a compassionate way, but we also have to be compassionate to the other people in our society and recognize that there are people who shouldn't be out there.
Secretary, your staff has compassionately told me that you have a day job I have to let you return to. So I have a final question, and this is really more as a member of the cabinet and someone who I know is very close with the president. What is the likelihood that Monday would be named a national holiday so that we could go to the CAPS parade? Or at least a flexible, could you take back, is there some kind of flexible work?
Well, I am so glad that the CAPS won because, it brings...
We needed something, this city, didn't we?
It brings a unit. It makes me remember Detroit back in 1967 and the Detroit riots that really tore that place apart. And it tore relationships between people apart. The very next year, the Detroit Tigers won the World Series after 37 years. And the unity that it brought to the city was amazing. And, we need to start thinking about the things that bring us together. And I think we can work out the things that divide us.
Well, we are all CAPS, and we are all Americans, and we are all thankful that you joined us today. Thank you.